Hello there. Welcome to Gung-Ho Talks, a brand new show for our brand new YouTube channel, where we'll be chatting with various VIPs in the gaming/geek field about anything from board games to movies, comics, and all manner of other goodies. On this, our maiden voyage, I'm joined by esteemed game designer Steve Jackson, here to talk about his brand newly revived project, the role-playing game, The Fantasy Trip. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. It's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to have an opportunity to talk about TFT. So definitely fire away.
All right. Well, let's head back because I know TFT came out a long time ago, and you have decades worth of experience in the field. Tell us a bit about how the game initially came to be and what it is exactly.
Okay, taking those in reverse order, what it is a light role-playing system with a detailed tactical module for combat, so you can play out your combats either straight weapons or magic. That's combined with a role-playing system that is, as I say, light on rules, hopefully to enable you to be long on story, and a world background and sample adventure that are just unabashed dungeon crawl settings. There are bad people down there. Let's go kill them and take their stuff. And as far as it came about, in the mid-'70s, I was playing original D&D, and I didn't like the combat system because it wasn't positional. Here come the orcs. They're going to hurt our wizard. Well, I'll get in the way. Except you can't, because you just name your target, and if you're in the general area, then the referee says, okay, roll it. And a good referee will pay attention to what you say you're doing, but that's not the same as having rules for it, being able to see where you are on the table, being able to take advantage of that bend in the corridor, all that stuff. So I was at the time a very newly minted game designer with one design to my credit, that was Ogre. And I said, well, I'd like to do a little combat game that would be fantasy combat, that would fill what I perceived as a need for the role-playing game. And at the time, the role-playing game was the role-playing game, the original D&D. So I did that, and that was Melee. And it was released by Metagaming as a $2.95 micro game, and it did very, very well. So Metagaming's owner gave me the go-ahead to write up a companion game that would be about magical combat. That became Wizard, and that also was very popular. That was at the hugely inflated price of $3.95. Then after that, we got to work, we had an in-house campaign, and we got to work on an actual role-playing release. And before all of that came out, Metagaming and I parted ways, and I ended up setting up my own company. But Metagaming continued with the Fantasy Trip for another, I think we split up in 1980, and I believe Metagaming closed in about 1982. So the Fantasy Trip was supported for a while, and it became popular. But then it wasn't supported anymore. Decades passed, during which some groups still preferred it and were still playing it, but there was very little support. There were some third-party people, creating old-school style clones of Fantasy Trip, and that met some needs. And I didn't have anything to say about that because I didn't own the rights. Okay, fast forward to last year. I was able to recover the rights, not to everything ever done to Fantasy Trip, but for the things that I had done myself. There's a relatively new U.S. law that under certain circumstances, after a long time passes, lets a creator reclaim his work. and that was what I did. And unfortunately, that didn't include the art. I hadn't done it, so I couldn't get it back.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, we are able to work with Liz Banford, who did the original counter art and illustrations for Melee. So we're going to be able to make the new version look a lot like the old one.
Speaking of the new version, what are some of the changes, if any, that are going to be added to the new one as opposed to the original? Because obviously
There,
it's been a long time since then, and
yes, nothing like 40 years of playtesting.
exactly.
There are some details of combat that are going to get smoothed off. Pole weapons are overpowered and will be nerfed a little bit, but not a lot. I'm making some changes in the character creation and advancement rules, which will affect the role-playing side more than the people who just want to play a combat game at lunch.
Mm-hmm.
But something that was noticed after some campaigns had run for years and years and years was that all high-level characters begin to look somewhat alike because they have advanced their stats to the point where they can make any reasonable roll and a lot of unreasonable rolls. So I'm working on that. I am making it much harder to create a super high powered character because again, this is about story, and you have a much more interesting story if you have people who are different from each other and cooperating to meet challenges than if you have Superman and Superman 2 and Superman 3 go down into the dungeon and stomp everything.
I agree with that sentiment wholeheartedly. Um, Speaking of role-playing systems in general and the 70s and 80s, you also came up with another system, which is GURPS. Are there any similar points in the mechanisms of TFT and GURPS? I'm simply posing these questions because I think more people are more aware of GURPS than TFT.
That's true at this point. Yes, there are certainly similarities. The biggest ones are they are both point-based character build. They both control movement on a hex grid because that's, in my mind, the one true way of doing it, except for the other true way, which is squares. But
I'm a
you
hex man myself, so
have to have more than one true way.
yeah, exactly.
Oh yes, and the other big one is 3d6 resolution.
Mm-hmm.
GURPS does 3d6 on almost everything. Fantasy Trip goes up to 4 and 5 dice on some difficult things.
Is it also roll under or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's roll stat or under to hit somebody.
Mm-hmm.
The differences are that Fantasy Trip is a whole lot lighter and less crunchy. I can put a whole character sheet for a complicated wizard on a 3x5 index card, if there was still such a thing as a 3x5 card anymore, and have room left over to draw a crummy little picture of it.
Gotcha. So you've been in the hobby for, as we mentioned, decades. How do you think gaming audiences differ globally, and do you think there's going to be more of a US market for TFT than European or Asian? How do you think that fits?
Well, the first difference in the global market is, as you say, it's global now. When I started writing, I was not writing for a global market. I was writing for the United States, Canada, and a few people in Germany. And that's no longer true. I hope that Fantasy Trip will be translated into other languages. I don't know enough about the current state of the role-playing zeitgeist in Europe to have a big idea whether this will catch on in a huge way. But it's a good game, and I think people will appreciate it because it lets you move quickly through character creation while still getting a character that you'll think is interesting and that can cooperate well with other characters and get down to storytelling and monster hacking.
Going forward to your plans for publishing this, correct me if I'm wrong, this will be a Kickstarter at some point during this year?
That's correct. We have it scheduled to start July 23rd.
All right, so that's not far off. And
Oh.
going further, do you have plans to self-publish more content for it? Go to crowdfunding again? What are your feelings on crowdfund versus regular distribution?
In this particular year of time, crowdfunding is the right answer for some things, not for everything. We definitely have a long list of follow-ons that we want to do, and I'm getting some interesting inquiries from writers who would like to get in on the game.
Do you also have plans to co-opt the community into making sort of contribute to certain pamphlets and magazines and stuff like that?
Yeah, we don't know exactly yet what ways we will do it, but I have a very, very active and opinionated forum for Fantasy Trip. It's so opinionated that sometimes we have to ask people to settle down a little bit. But
as forums do sometimes.
Yes, but it's great to watch the interplay of ideas. And one of our forum users is one of the people who has already sent me a couple of things to look at. We'll see. Definitely, I would like to do an open call at some point and tell people, hey, want a chance to get a monster in a monster book? Send me something cool. And what we are doing right now is publishing on the Fantasy Trip website a lot of little new snippets that I've written. These are not things that will be in the published books. These are new things that I've generated that we're just putting out there, and people will use them for whatever game they want to use. They're, where stats are needed, they're given for Fantasy Trip. Some of these descriptions don't even require stats because, I keep coming back to this, their story. I should say, if anybody wants to hit the Fantasy Trip website, it is thefantasytrip.game.
We'll definitely link that. I was just looking at it earlier myself. So looking forward to accessing the forums as well. Steve Jackson Games have published many things in the past in many genres. Two things here. You've published things like Munchkin, Shea Geek, Ogre, GURPS, and many others. What is your favorite out of those? I know it's like trying to pick among your children, but, bear with me.
Okay, yeah, you got totally ahead of me there, because the answer I always give to that question is ask a parent to pick their favorite child. That really is what I say. It depends on the game, and it depends. Sometimes I don't want to play one of my own. Sometimes I want to say, okay, show me something new. But to try to give you a straight answer anyway, even though it's picking among my children, I still like playing Munchkin a lot. I got to play 10 games of Ogre all at once at the Origins that just ended, and I had a great time. I'm really enjoying the playtest process for the Fantasy Trip stuff as it goes on. But there are other games that I get to play. Phil Reed recently introduced me to a game called Century, and I should give a shout out to that, because Century is fun. And I'm looking at a copy of Terraforming Mars up on my bookshelf right now, and so on. So we are in a golden age of game creation.
And that brings me to my next question. This golden age where concepts blend to form new genres, new styles, new experiences. Things like the Conan Miniatures game, for example, sort of blending RPG concepts with board gaming. Do you feel like concepts, traditional RPG concepts like TFT, like GURPS, do you feel they will ever become obsolete and be replaced entirely with new experiences?
Well, if I could imagine what that new experience would be, I would immediately move to get ahead of it. But at the same time, it would just be foolish to say there will never be anything new. Sophocles probably thought that he was the be-all and end-all when he was writing his plays, that plays like the ones he was writing with the chorus and everything would be the highest form of cultural entertainment forever. And no, it didn't work out that way. We have written forms that he didn't anticipate. Of course, just his plays were meant to be viewed, not read.
Mm-hmm.
And we have media that he didn't imagine. So I don't know what could come on, a telepathic full immersion or something like that. If that kind of thing becomes popular, then you won't have any more people playing modern role-playing games than play Whist right now. The answer to that is, yeah, some people still play Whist, but not very many.
That's true.
That was a real rant. Did that make any sense?
It did to me.
Okay.
So I'm hoping anybody listening in will also make sense of it. Going back to the new experience avenue, I'm thinking of the AI driven role playing / board games and the app driven ones. Do you feel like you will ever take TFT in that direction, make it a sort of, co-op versus AI versus actual electronic AI game in the future?
Haven't thought about it much. I don't have any offers on the table for the computerization of TFT,
Mm-hmm.
and we know it's beyond our competence as a company. That's not what we do. I would sure listen to a proposal on that. They'd have to spend some time bringing me up to speed, explaining what it was they were doing before I could judge whether I thought it was right for the game.
Gotcha. Doubling back on the game's mechanisms, what are some other current day role-playing game systems that TFT can be TFT is similar to?
Wow, I don't think it's super similar to anything.
That's what I gathered from
It's
reading about it, so I'm curious to know what bits and pieces of it remind you or would remind people about other games.
Well, if you've ever played Tunnels and Trolls, it's about the same degree of likeness, but it handles it in an entirely different way.
I think I've seen it played once. Don't
Okay.
don't quote me on it, but I think I've seen it played. Um, what are the recommended party amounts for the game? Do you feel like it scales well upwards of 6, 7 players?
It wasn't originally intended for that. I've done it with as many as a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
It helps if they have some familiarity with the game, so you can just holler out, "Okay, any dexterity 13s, you go." It does need a referee with that many players, even if you're just even if you're just doing combat. Either a referee or some one player who's a really take charge type.
Mm-hmm.
My my personal ideal, and I've tried not to make this a requirement of the game. My personal ideal is 4 to 6 people sitting around a table with one game master and optionally one monster player who is not the game master, but who has the briefing on the scenario and will run the monsters when the time comes.
Okay, that's an interesting aspect that I haven't really heard of before. Generally, you have the GM and the players, so that's definitely something to keep an eye out for.
It lets somebody get into it. It's a good role for someone who is tactically skilled,
Mm-hmm.
but might not be interested in being cooperative that day, or just
Or be
just
much
a
of a role
once.
player.
Uh-huh. Of course, well played monsters and opponents is also role playing. But when it
Definitely.
comes down to I swing, do I hit?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tactical thing, and that frees the referee to make completely unbiased judgments.
All right. Well, everything sounds really interesting. Hitting Kickstarter, you said July uh,
July 23rd, yes.
23rd. All right. The monkey wrench that I like to throw at the end of interviews is a final
Monkey
thought.
wrench. Okay.
Would you rate The Last Jedi for us out of 10 and there are no wrong answers?
Ah, I have a wrong answer for you. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, well, I've definitely come across that answer, so it's not at all wrong.
Haven't seen Solo yet either.
I definitely recommend Solo if you haven't seen it.
Okay, yeah, it got bad reviews, and I'm going. How can how can a film about Han Solo be bad?
Definitely. It was, I went twice. I loved it. The family loved it. So it was pretty fun. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time again.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for some good questions.
Thank you. It's definitely been interesting to have you as our first interviewee here.
Well, I wish you a long run and good luck.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for listening. If you wish to see more weekly content, subscribe to our channel and have as nice a day as you deserve.